So just wanted to start by apologising because I introduced you as the cinematographer, but your credit is director of photography. And what's the difference? Is my first.
There is no difference.
Aha.
It's a very, very old difference, transatlantic thing, but we're all. There is an issue that there is only one director on the set, so we've come to be cinematographers, I think.
That's just so there's no confusion.
So, yeah, and there's no pomposity.
Which brings me to the next thing. If there are not two directors on the set, there's an interesting credit here for animation director with the late Mark Gustafson. No.
Gustafson.
Yeah. Who died last month at the age of 64, very young. Is there always an animation director on an animation?
No. So what you have to understand about this film is this is the first point at which Wes Anderson touches animation properly. And it's also our first experience of working with him. So you have him coming from a live action world, and you have a phalanx of really quite good stop frame animation talent going into this for the first time. So it was a clash because he has a very, very particular way of working, and we didn't understand that. So Mark was put in there as an interface to be on the studio floor and to direct the animation and to give Wes a steer, if you like, on what you can and can't do. As it transpired, that didn't really work in that way because Wes has a way of doing it. Having done a couple of full movies with him and several bits of movies with him, you don't sign up for a Wes Anderson movie thinking that it is going to be anything other than that. You do not bring yourself to the table. You are there as a head of department to get what is in his head onto the screen. He is not going to turn to me and say, Tristan, what do you think? And although that felt on this movie as if we were being just acting like robots in a way, just doing that. Actually, it when you consider it, it is a way of using your talent, because to get what is in his head onto the screen is actually quite difficult, because what he demands of you is something that up until this point we hadn't really tried in animation. And a lot of that is to do with dull stuff that we won't cover tonight, like physics and optics and things like that. But, in terms of what he was asking for from every department, it was difficult and it was often frustrating. But Mark was a sort of buffer to that, and I would just like to take a moment just to think about what he put in. I mean, he was a fantastic, funny, solid guy. He won an Academy Award last year for co-directing Pinocchio with Guillermo del Toro. And what he had to be on this job was the mattress between us and Wes, and that meant he was being punched from both sides. And so that was a very solid piece of work that he did, and I think we all loved him for it. And at the end of the film, he was always taking little bits of video and taking stills, and at the end of the film, as a way of essentially purging himself of the experience, he put together this short film for the crew that was a sort of screaming polemic of frustration and anger, and then sat down the night before he showed the crew and watched it on his own and decided that actually that wasn't what he wanted to do, and he recut it, and it became a poem for the crew.
Oh, that's lovely.
And it became this rather loving, gentle, just series of shots of people at their best, and that's what he gave to us.
Okay, so what you've just described is, if I get this right, is that you and many of the other people working on the film had been working for many years in a certain kind of way, and you come across somebody who works in a completely different kind of way. Was it something to do with trying to do his background had been entirely in live action, and he was trying to make this animated film a live action film.
Yes, entirely. And on top of that, this extraordinarily strict manner that he has of making films. You know, every one of Wes Anderson's films, brilliant though many of them are, is in a way a reinterpretation of all his other films. You know, there are certain tropes that he has to have within that. You know, to be simplistic about it, you know, there is always a top-down shot of food very well laid out on the table. You know, you'll find that in every film he's made. And it's as if there is a ticking off process and a refining process. So we come into this half or 2/3 of the way through his filmmaking life, and there were issues on both sides, because, you know, we marched in there with several feature films in our backpack and several shorts in our backpack and hundreds of commercials, and we knew what we were doing. And suddenly he went, actually, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do this. And we went, well, you can't do that. And he said, well, you show me then. Show me what you can't do. And we went, oh, that's ridiculous. And he went, no, don't just tell me you can't do it and I'll have another idea. Show me how far you can go with this. And so we go, well, you can have this much. And you go, well, I think you can go a bit further. and you can understand that was a learning process on both sides, and there was a lot of frustration on both sides. By the time we got to Isle of Dogs, it was a walk in the park, because he knew that he could trust us.
Yes.
So there was none of that getting to know you process. And we were ready for anything, in as much as, you know, new people on the crew were going, oh my God, this is a nightmare. And we're just going, you know, this is it. This is how it is. You do it or you go home. You know?
And you've obviously now got a very substantial relationship with him, because you're, apart from the two features, animated features, you've also worked extensively on animated sections on other films like The French Dispatch and Grand Budapest
City,
Grand
Budapest,
Asteroid
and
City,
Henry Sugar,
yeah.
Because, well, the interesting thing is that actually, you know, we've each absorbed things, because his process in live action has developed enormously out of what he did in animation. So he now fully storyboards his live action films. And he even will cut an animatic so that he knows what he's getting when he goes onto the set. So the amount of coverage he's shooting is substantially less. And that what that means, especially when you're building the kind of sets he's building, is you know how much set you need to build. So you're not overbuilding sets. And you know on each day that if you get through that shot list, you've shot the day. If then you want coverage and you've got time, you can shoot coverage. But, you know, that laying out of what you need, it means every department knows the shot angle, and whether it's a close-up, a two-shot, a wide, whatever it is, it's there on the storyboard. So that spine is super useful for him, because he loves more than anything else that order and that control of the image.
Are you saying that this wasn't fully storyboarded?
This was fully storyboarded, but he now uses that process in his live action films. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. This was a complete revelation to me once I started researching even a little bit of how it was made. I don't know how much any of you know about the way that animated films, and in particular stop motion films, are made. I knew absolutely nothing. There's a factory of simultaneous sets. Is that not the case? There's something like over 100 sets.
No, there's not over 100 sets, but there are many tens of sets. It's the only way you can do it and not take 20 years.
So we're talking about the same building, the same floor space, or several units.
You're talking about an enormous floor space.
Yeah.
So typically we would have 3 or 4 sound stages with 50 or 60 sets shooting simultaneously when we're at full chat. We didn't start there. We start with 4, 8, 10, and off we go. And as we go, we gather crew. So, you know, the core crew are there, and we're building the look of the movie in a small way. And then we bring people in and we go, this is this is how we want this to look, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And you hit a point where it is intensely busy. And, everyone thinks that animation is slow. Animation is not slow. It takes a long time, and there is a difference there. So everyone is working as fast as they can. The animators are working as fast as they can within the limits of getting it looking beautiful. But it takes time. And the only way to keep the shoot down to a reasonable length is to have many multiples of sets. But what that gives you is it gives you slack where you need it, because if you're dropping time on 2 or 3 sets, if Wes, for instance, is getting very picky about a prop, if that set slips a day, that's fine. You've got 59 other sets shooting. So it gives you that, you can push and pull on it when it's at that size. But it's huge. The crew is upwards of 400 people once you get to that size.
And in terms of keeping the simultaneity of it in your head, how you just get used to it.
You get used to it, exactly, and it does. It gets to the point where it occupies your every waking moment. I did a film in the States where we had more units than that, and my eyes would open in the morning in bed, and I would immediately be going, Unit 1, Unit 2, 3, 4, just numbering them off in my head. What I had to do on each of those that day, what I had to tell people about it. And I was in the stage at 7 a.m. to see rushes on my own, so I had a heads up on what I would then watch with the director later, just so I kept it in here. But for me, the way I work isn't necessarily how other people who do my job work, and let's face it, there's probably only 3 or 4 other people who do that.
I was thinking that.
But for me, the film has to look like one hand made it. And so my top down on the look of it has to be very strong. So although I have other guys who light for me, I give them extensive directorial notes, lighting notes, and I will make up a lighting script, color script, time of day script, emotion script, which I have on the wall of my office, so I know where every shot lands in the film in terms of palette, where is the sun. Just simple things like that. But what color is the sky? Fox is different in that respect because it's pretty much all orange. But in general, we have, I need to know where I am in the film. So when I say to someone, look, I'd like you to light this sequence for me, it's 6 p.m. The sun's going down over there. This is the action in this. I need to see every test shot that comes off that, and we'll sit and I'll tell you what you need to know. And they're all very, very talented people in their own right. But for the duration of the shoot, it has to look like I did it. Otherwise, you get discontinuity in the lighting, especially across that number of sets. And the same is true of animation. So you can see in this film that not all those Fantastic Mr. Foxes are the same puppet.
Right.
Because
they're different sizes.
They're not different. Well, there are certainly scale changes, but actually, all the full-grown, fully furred Mr. Foxes, there's about a dozen of them, right, because they wear out and because they're needed on multiple sets simultaneously. And there are tiny differences in the design. One of them's got a slightly wide head, for instance, which I always see, but animators put themselves into that character. So when you animate, you're essentially acting through that puppet. So there is a casting process that takes place with the animators in order for there to be continuity of performance as well as continuity of look. Because you can spot, some animators have different skills and they will be cast to a character so that, all the close-up emotional stuff of Mrs. Fox, for instance, was pretty much covered off by just 2 animators. Huh. Whereas if you've got a crowd screaming and waving their arms in the air, you can throw 2 or 3 people at it and it doesn't matter because people aren't looking at that continuity. So it's about, one hand made it. And the other thing is, everything you see on that screen is made in the hand. There are very, very few what we would call VFX in it. There's almost no green screen in it, for instance, which is pretty rare for a stop frame movie in this day and age. Most of those backdrops are painted. there's a tiny bit, but there really isn't very much. You know, and Wes's insistence on that handmade, very old-fashioned look, which again was something that made me squirm. You know, the fact that the fire is made out of carved pears soap, and the smoke is cotton wool, and the water is cling film. You know, we had kind of moved beyond that 15 years before we made Fantastic Mr. Fox, and we were happily dropping in little bits of computer-generated water, smoke and fire, and it looking great and seamlessly blending it in. Sometimes even just shooting. There's a shot in A Close Shave where Gromit puts the kettle on and he turns the gas on his tiny model cooker, puts his tiny model kettle on it, but we shot a real gas hob and just cut it out and dropped it in and used the real live action flame under it, and you don't question it. Wes would not have that. Wes would have us build that flame out of quality street wrappers and animate it in order to get that look.
That's very interesting.
So he's a great purist in that respect.
It must have driven you up the wall then initially. Yeah.
A little, but you know, it's kind of what people love about it. I've grown to love this film because of how people react to it. The experience of working on it was, by any definition, difficult. There are people here who worked on it and they will agree with me. But you grow to love it because everyone says, God, I love that film. My kids love that film. But a lot of adults love it as well, which is unusual.
But that's true of a lot of your work, I think. I mean, I'm thinking of Curse of the Were Rabbit on the one hand, and Paranormal on the next. Paranorman on the next one. I'm making a lot of mistakes sitting next to you. Yes, it is something that stop motion seems to generate that kind of affection. A wide. Do you know why that would be?
I mean, I can conjecture.
Go on, do it. It'll make good YouTube.
I think it's about the handmadeness of it. You know, it's not made by people sitting in front of screens. It's actually made by people interacting with their hands and their eyes in three-dimensional space. You know, it's exactly the same process as shooting a movie with actors, but everything is smaller and you have to move the actors. But other than that, the process for creating that environment is the same. Your production designer and your art director create that world, and it is built. And it's real, and it has to be painted with a paintbrush. You know, it's not surfaced in a piece of software. That is not to detract from that as a way of making films, because there are many magnificent films made in that way. But I think the feeling that it's holdable, I think, gives it that reality. And also just simple things like the way you photograph it. You know, it's very, very difficult, even with the best of modern CG, to create something, for instance, like depth of field that looks realistic. Whereas if you're shooting through a piece of glass on a camera, you get realistic depth of field. So that gives it, again, that solidity and that reality.
Isn't this you're going to have to explain what depth of field is, but isn't it difficult to achieve on this scale with when you've got small sets?
It is.
Explain what it is, Tristan.
It's one of the things. It is one of the things that differs from shooting live action. So, for my mantra is that we should never let the animation get in the way of the cinematography. You know, my job is to make stuff look good and make it look beautiful, and not really concede that I'm shooting animation. I don't think you should register you're watching animation. I think the script should work well enough for you to be put into the story and not worry about the medium. But there are bits of physics that get in the way. So, you know, typically an animation character is about the size of that bottle of water. Mr. Fox is slightly bigger because of his elongated shape, and Rat is about 15 inches high, one of the biggest puppets I've worked with. But you live in a world that is scaled to essentially a 25 centimeter character. So all the houses, all the trees, all the grass, all the knives and forks are scaled to that size, which means that the camera is the size of a small family car relative to what you are trying to shoot. And that's the modern digital cameras that we use. When we shot on film, it was like having a removal truck on set. And I'm not kidding. I've got photographs of cameras that are bigger than the set. So now you have a camera. So the camera has to work very, very close to the character. So if the character's head is the size of the top joint of my thumb, which it often is, maybe wider, but certainly not higher, in order to get a close-up on that, you're probably working at the absolute limits of focus on the lens. So you're working at minimum focus, at which point all the normal lens characteristics and maths go out of the window. So if you and I were being photographed for a feature film, I'm the camera, you're the beautiful leading lady, I could very, very easily focus from the end of your nose to the wall. I could focus from the end of your nose to the horizon if I wanted to from here by adjusting the lens accordingly. If you're an animation puppet, the camera's here. I can get focus from the end of your nose to the bridge of your nose. I'm down to millimeters in terms of depth of field. So in order to achieve something that looks naturalistic, so that you're not constantly banging your head on the stylistic wall of everything looking like a toy, in order to give you a better depth of focus, so that maybe from your nose to your eye is in focus, which can be a nice look. It doesn't matter if your ear drops off a bit, that's fine. We have to work with the lens shut right down. So basically, the nearer to a pinhole you get, the better your depth of field, the better your depth of focus. So a pinhole, imagine an infinitely small hole will give you infinite focus. So the bigger the hole gets in the lens, the shallower the depth of field becomes. But when you're working at minimum focus, you need to make that hole as tiny as you possibly can in order to get a focus that looks like the lens is wide open in live action. Then you factor in Wes Anderson, because what Wes Anderson wants is deep focus. So he's asking you to be in focus, that gentleman over there to be in focus, and the background to be in focus. You can do that in live action because the camera's here. If the camera's here, I'm struggling to get your ear in focus. So how do we do that? And this is where the conversation starts with Wes. I'm sorry I can't give you that. Show me what you can give me. Show me what you can give me. And then you start thinking, well, okay, well, maybe there's some tricks I can use to get around this. So if you use a wider angle lens closer in, that improves your depth of field. So then you start to get that look, when you get those close-ups on those foxes with those foreshortened noses and the big eyes and the head looks very wide in the close-up. It's because the lens is much, much wider than you would normally take a close-up on. You typically take a close-up on a longer lens, on a longer focal length lens. So working like that. And then on Isle of Dogs, we were actually splitting the frame up. So we would shoot the foreground and then we'd refocus and we'd shoot the midground and we'd refocus and we'd shoot the background and then we'd stitch it together. So there's a bit more post on Isle of Dogs. But it has those great open landscapes. It has more reach.
And these are kind of discoveries, aren't they? Because until he made you do that, you hadn't tried it.
Well, it's not so much about not trying it. It's about lenses are designed to function optimally between wide open and about halfway. The other end is just there because you can, but it compromises the quality of the image. So, back then, one of the first animated films shot digitally. It was shot on digital stills cameras. The tech wasn't quite ready for it, so we were struggling with a piece of equipment that wasn't quite good enough for what we wanted, and we were using stills lenses that aren't designed to photograph stuff for the big screen, and they have a lot of quirky things to them that are great if you're taking a still. These cameras are designed for, as I've often said, grandma next to the Christmas tree, kids on the beach, a couple more images and that's it. That's what you do in a year. But they're not designed to take a sequence of coherent images that are all the same, even color, contrast, or whatever. Now they are, but this is 15 years ago. And the glass that you photograph them with, there's a lot of aberrations in there. So you get color fringing, you get soft spots in the image. Now, all that can be used to your advantage if you're shooting, if you want that. But if you don't want it, you have to work with it. And when you've got fur very, very close up, all those things become an absolute nightmare. And we had it with fox and we had it with Isle of Dogs when our technology had improved a lot. Because what fur is close up is it's like a diffraction grating, which means that it actually produces a degree of chromatic breakup. So you get rainbowing on the fur, which is impossible to do anything about. So you just have to live with it. It's stylistic, I mean, the wind is always blowing in Fantastic Mr. Fox because every time the animator touches the puppet, the fur moves. So how do you get around that? You either spend millions fixing it in VFX, or you just have the wind blowing on the soundtrack, and then you get organic fur movements.
There's something I wanted to ask you. Is it called flutter? There's something in my head about animators. You tell them not to wear white if they're flicker.
Yeah.
Because if they wear white, it reflects onto the. Explain.
Well, it is as simple as you've just said. Basically, a white T-shirt is a light, because if there's any ambient light falling on your T-shirt, it will reflect onto the set. So we like our animators to wear black, and we like them to stand in the same place, because as you move around the set, of course, just the ambient light that you are either reflecting or occluding is enough to cause flicker. But most animators know this. This is day one, page one, line one.
News to me.
I once shot a commercial at Aardman about 25 years ago, which was on film. So we had to wait for it to come back, and there was horrendous flicker on that. And I spoke to the animator about it, and he admitted that he had worn a white sweatshirt. And I, as a punishment, made him a floor-length black cloak with an elasticated neck that I made him wear because he had to reshoot it, and he wore it willingly as an act of penance because he knew he had done wrong, and so I made, and it was hot as well, so he had to, and he was like Robert De Niro carrying a sack of armor up a waterfall. It was his penance for that.
Gosh, how stern and strict.
Yeah.
But I guess you have to be. Okay, well, I haven't exhausted my many questions about it, because it's an area, as you say, you're one of a handful of people, and you've worked with all of them probably.
I know them all intimately.
Yes, you probably all started out at Aardman, didn't you?
We probably all went through Aardman, yeah. And there's a reason for that, because there are very few permanent stop frame studios on the planet. And in fact, there was only Aardman until Leica came along. And now there is only Aardman and Leica, and occasionally one will pop up. We did 4 movies at 3 Mills. We did Isle of Dogs and Fantastic Mr. Fox with Wes. I worked on those, but also Corpse Bride was shot there, and Frankenweenie was shot there. So, but each one of those was a standalone production. It was just shot in the same barn. So Aardman is the fixed point around which the stop frame world turns, and most people go through it at some point. And I was lucky enough to be there when they were 3 men and a dog, quite literally. I started there when I was very, very, very young, and they were working out of a garage in Clifton in Bristol, and they offered me a couple of weeks' work, and I loved it. And it was nothing I'd ever considered, and it is nothing I would recommend to anyone as a career path. I mean, it is ludicrous, but it was an enormously and intensely creative time for them. They were taking off vertically, and every month another 5 people would turn up, and you just go bang, 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 and within no time at all we were shooting The Wrong Trousers, and for which we won an Academy Award. Indeed. And then on we went, and within no time at all we were shooting Chicken Run, and the good one, not the one that's out now. and then on it went. And then it got to a point where it had achieved such size that sense of creativity had given way to a sense of, isn't this all getting a bit big? Isn't this all getting a bit expensive? Isn't this and I stepped away, and they stepped away from me. To be fair, I would love to say that I tossed my hands in the air and walked away, but it was a mutual parting, which was the best thing that ever happened for me. And I'm not speaking out of turn to say that I think creatively they have plateaued, and that's what happens when you get that big, I think.
Right. And it just turned out lucky that Fantastic Mr. Fox was shooting here.
Yeah, I mean, I went and banged on that door. I have to say, they didn't approach me for it, and the reason they didn't approach me for it is because they already had a DP, and I didn't know. And because they put Mark Gustafson, and he had been working at Vincent in the States, and he had someone he wanted to light it, and I didn't know that. And I went to the producer and I showed them my reel, and the reel went to Wes, and Wes said, I want him. So and when I found out, I was intensely embarrassed, because I would not have done that, because it's not good form. But that is what happened, and I got that job. And it was funny, actually, because the sense at the time was that he was so quirky that it was going to be a very odd and difficult ride, which indeed it was, but that's what we made. So sometimes that's good for you.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And if your sense was that the previous, you'd gone as far as you could with Aardman, then this kind of creative struggle was perfect, really.
I think so, because you come off your game if your game is the same, and I think the house style at Aardman was very strong, and it was indeed what got them where they are. But it's still a house style. There's not a lot that lies beyond that. So I think I'd shot a lot of Wallace.
Sure.
And I knew how to shoot Wallace. I mean, we kind of invented, in Wrong Trousers, we invented how to make Wallace and Gromit. The Grandeur had happened, but that was essentially a student film, and we created it. And also what we did was we took stop frame animation from kids' TV series to cinema, and we had that mission. That wasn't just something that happened. We needed to justify the size of the canvas on which we were showing it, and so we wanted to make it cinematic. And that's what we did,
It is
kind of
a total success.
Found the way.
Right. Questions. There's one there.
Hello. I'd like to ask some advice, please. So the scenes that are shot underground, which there are quite a few in this film.
Yeah.
As a storyteller or as a cinematographer, do you have to justify your light source all the time? So, for example, you have the mineral deposit room, and we have all the sparkling diamonds.
I'm so glad you asked me this.
And then but then I was looking for where light sources were, like underground.
Yeah.
And then, you've got the gorgeous waterfall. But then when they're digging, there's no obvious light source.
No.
So I thought, is there a way?
You're right. It's always a problem in everything, isn't it? I mean, why are bedrooms so well lit in films? You can always see people in bed in films. So, you have to find a way. I'm very grateful for you for mentioning those two scenes, the waterfall and the crystal cave, because actually that is one thing that I managed to put before Wes, which he bit down on, which was whenever the foxes are in conflict, that the environment they are in should be beautiful. And I said to him, I can do this with light. And he said, let me see it. And I did. And we made up that crystal cave. Took a long time to find a way to make it twinkle. And we actually, I had built 2 discs about 10 inches across with multiple bare quartz halogen bulbs in the edges. And they were mounted on motors and they rotated. And then the wall is covered in mica and glitter. So as the lights rotate, the angle of incidence changes and you get the twinkle. But there are enough light sources for the lights on the foxes to look as if they're constant. And similarly on the waterfall, there's a lot of rolling gobo in there and there's a lot of texture in there. And I think you just, it's a film, it's not a radio play, so you have to be able to see what's going on, and there are limits, and he does push for darkness a lot, whereas, he's constantly saying darker, darker, darker. And I was looking at that scene on the porch with Bean just looking to camera, and I was thinking, God, that's really bloody dark, he's just like, he's really pushed me on that, and we probably brought it down in the grade as well. But sometimes, like those very graphic digging scenes, they're almost like diagrams. They're almost like 2D. And I think the sense there was, this is so highly illustrative that this is just flat light. It's flat, dim light. And we just believe that as a thing. But yeah, I think if you're in a cave, why shouldn't there be a magical light source? It's full of, I don't know, moths or fairies or something, just that twinkle. Otherwise you can't see a damn thing, and what's the point, And there's a scene in Wrong Trousers where Wallace is in the wardrobe. He's locked in the wardrobe and then he kicks the bottom out and the wrong trousers start going up and down and the wardrobe explodes. But getting a 35mm camera with a 400-foot mag into a wardrobe about this big that was meant to be completely dark and getting an exposure in there and trying to justify where the light was coming from, because it was obviously only coming through the crack in the door, which had been locked. You just have to make it up. You can put in a source, you can put in the tiniest of sources and then just start filling as if it's doing a lot more than it really is, I guess.
Poetic license. Another question. I can't see anyway. Has somebody got one? Yeah.
No, here's some.
Very good. Thank you.
Hi, this might be utter nonsense, but I was just based on things that you've said around how so few people like you, and they've all gone through Aardman. Is there something inherently British about stop motion and the fact that this was filmed in Britain, and it feels like it's something that almost plays to the British sensibilities of like reveling in the imperfections, like you said, of the fair and the wind and whatnot. Is there any link to that, or is
it's an interesting question. We do have a lot of people who are very good at it here, but it would be unfair to neglect the role of the Americans in this process, because Nightmare Before Christmas, is a very American film, and Henry Selick was certainly driving that. And then you look at Rankin Bass, and Rankin Bass used to produce these Christmas films they did Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and things like that, and that very much informed what Wes likes, that Rankin Bass look. And then of course you have Vinton's in Portland, from which Leica grew, and they were doing California Raisins, they were doing all kinds of things at very much the same time as Aardman. I think what happened with Aardman is that they managed themselves very well. So Vincent's got into a lot of financial trouble. Aardman managed themselves much better. They were more cautious, and they were making very high quality shorts that did very well. They got a brace of Academy Awards quite early on, were then able to move into features, and it was all about quality. Chicken Run did incredibly well at the box office. I think it stands today as the highest grossing stop motion film ever made. So they had that there, and people flocked there to work on it. So yeah, what we do is very British, but I don't think you can take Leica out of this equation, because they are making films with largely American crews now. Although it is fair to say that when they started making films, they were getting a lot of us over there to kind of, just set it up, really, because this is where the skills base was. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I understand I haven't really answered it, but that is what I have to offer on it, if you like. So I'm sorry I haven't.
There's no, to your knowledge, there's no specific training here for it, is there?
Well, there is and there isn't. I mean, doing what I do, there is zero specific training. But as I like to say, there shouldn't really be a difference between lighting for animation and lighting for live action. But if you're lighting live action feature films, why the hell would you want to do what I'm doing? Why would you? Occasionally you get the odd person who wants to do it, which is great, because God knows we're not getting any younger. Those, the kind of top three, I am the youngest by probably a decade. So, it's we need some young blood. It's like being the last person who speaks a language.
Yeah.
You just kind of you're recorded and then you go into an archive somewhere and that's it.
God, what a frightening thought. Another question. Yes, they're coming thick and fast now. I've noted you're there.
So just based on what you said and depth of field and the scale that you're working at, I was wondering how you actually managed to pull off the zoom shots, which is obviously a trope that Wes Anderson uses quite a lot. Was that one of the difficulties you had, or is it simpler?
Yeah, that's interesting. We do use zoom lenses, and we use motion control, of course, obviously. On this film, again, because they were just using these Nikon stills cameras that weren't really right for what we wanted. We were actually, I had some adapters made to mount a Cooke 5:1, 20-100 mil, beautiful Cooke 5:1 lens onto the front. So we had to have a special lens mount made and a doubler so that it covered the full frame sensor. And that's what we used. And they were by no means ideal, because they are a lens with a probably at least 60-year heritage on them that were designed to shoot onto film. And although they look nice on an Alexa, back then they don't necessarily look nice on a Nikon D3. But that's what we used. That's what we had. We now use lightweight Canon cine zooms, which are very good on those cameras. So yeah, but we have motion control. So, all those very funky, I'd forgotten quite how funky those moves are. You get these kind of camera moves that kind of go like this, as if, hunting for the goal scorer. But it's all motion control. So, the move is done a frame at a time. So you can build it very, very accurately. But yeah, so we use Cooke 5:1s. And of course, the great advantage of them is that they don't drop any stop when you zoom, whereas zooms designed for stills cameras, it's very difficult to drive them mechanically because they're not made for that. And B, they tend to drop stop as you zoom in. You can go down a stop and a half easily on a still zoom. So we needed a cine zoom to do that.
Very good. It sounds as though you're at the mercy of equipment a lot more than it might be if you're on a conventional film.
Far less now. Yeah, we have cameras now that do the job for us perfectly well. This was just a sort of transition point. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Actually, yeah, there was a lady there.
Talking about lighting again. When lighting non-animation, lights are quite big. My question is, did you use stencils and cutouts to make this specific small lighting when you use like spotlights and stuff like that on
or Mr. Fox?
Okay. Let me answer that generally and then specifically. So there's often a misconception that we use very tiny lights because we have very tiny things. We don't. We use every size of light. So if you think about a sunlit exterior, for instance, on a model, the model might be the size of this room. What you want it to look like is a sunlit exterior. So what you don't want is for your shadows to diverge. And the smaller your light, the more your shadows will diverge. So if I'm lighting an exterior, I want the biggest damn light I can get with the biggest lens on it. And, I've had converted arc lights made with lenses nearly 3 feet wide because they give me coherent shadows and then it looks like the real world. But if you use a small light, everything does that. You see what I mean? So the shadows are running off in all different directions, and also they fall away. So the sharpness of the shadow decays far too quickly. So we're looking for realism. Because the thing about animation is you create this universe in which anything is possible. You know, all the houses can lean at 45 degrees and all the characters can have one eye bigger than the other and one leg. That's fine, but it's still got to look like a believable environment. And if it looks like the sun is only the size of a ping pong ball, that doesn't work. So you have to think about lighting it in the most naturalistic way. From that, we go all the way down to the tiniest of tiny LEDs. LEDs have transformed the way we work because they're so damn small, you know, and they don't produce a lot of heat. Some do, but a lot don't. And we can actually put them on characters. You know, if we need a bit of fill on two people very close to each other, we can actually embed an LED in the chest of the person off camera. So we use all kinds of things. The secret to a good hard pattern is a good hard light. So in Fox, all that patterning coming up through the floor in the sewer is just done with point sources. Again, little, mostly 12 volts quartz halogen bubbles, which produce a very hard shadow. And there's a scene when Mrs. Fox fights Rat, where there's a lighting change in the scene, and it just becomes a projected shadow on the wall. And that was done dynamically in the animation. That's not a cut, that's one shot through. So we faded the lights down, and I had a dado light with the lens out. And a dado light bulb, 24 volt, 150 watt, super tiny point source gives you a fantastic, very, very hard shadow. And that's what that came up and projected the fight shadow onto the wall. So the answer is we use every kind of light you could possibly think of, but we don't use HMIs because we run these things 14 hours a day for 18 months. It's just too damn expensive. I don't need to shoot under daylight. And we don't use fluorescence because, again, their life just isn't good enough. So we use a lot of tungsten and a lot of LED.
Hope you're taking notes. Very good.
Sorry, if someone asks a tech question, they get a tech answer.
No, this is good. It is very technical, the whole thing. There's one there, yeah, good.
Thank you very much. 2 questions and maybe a couple of comments. What are you working on next? And also about the previous films in Isle of Dogs, the fight of the dogs is what you described was like a cotton ball. If you can talk more how that scene was also created. And also just a comment about animation in other parts of the world. In the Soviet Union, there was a strong clay motion. And bring to my mind, I can remember the hedgehog in the I forgot. Anyway, check out Soviet Union animation. It's great. It's going down the hill now, but yeah, thanks.
Okay, quite a lot of things there. Yeah, I'm aware of animators like Schwankmeyer and things like that, but and although that has been very influential, I think the size of the industry was quite small in terms of what was coming out of there. In terms of what I'm doing next, we're currently experiencing a lull in the stop frame animation feature business because we've just parked Chicken Run 2, Pinocchio, and Wendell and Wild, so there's going to be a little dip now, so we rely on commercials. The fight ball in Isle of Dogs, I can speak specifically about. So that is basically a multi-legged spider scorpion of armature. So an armature is essentially a skeleton made out of steel rods and tension ball and socket joints. And onto that was built a carapace of cotton wool and various bits of debris and sections of dog. And then the whole thing just kind of is animated, it just kind of roils away and a leg pops out and an ear pops out and a mouth pops out and then the cotton ball boils away. But it's all built on a solid thing. Tony, are you in the room? Did you animate that? Okay.
You see,
Am I speaking sense? Okay, thank you. Tony is animator who works on both those movies.
look,
Is Andy here? Andy.
it's a reunion. How fantastic.
Andy Gent, who I didn't know was in the room, very naughty, didn't tell me. Andy Gent built the puppets for both those movies. So you should give him a round of applause. Yes, I haven't said anything rude about the puppets, so that's good. I'm absolutely right about the fight cloud. Thank you very much, Andy. In fact, we recently did one, didn't we, in a commercial that was like a scaled-down version of it.
Wait, what were some new ideas with that?
Yeah, we put some lights into it. That's right. Yeah. So there's a series of Just Eat adverts coming out soon, everyone. Stop frame, which features a cut-down fight cloud sequence.
You've done a lot of ads, haven't you? Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's what buys
That's bread and butter.
Yes, that's brilliant. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, have you got any sense of... There's always a call for stop frame.
You say?
No. There's always a call for stop frame in ads. It's very popular.
It does come and go.
Yeah.
It comes and goes. And sometimes the advertising business as a whole is as flat as a pancake right now. It's very, very poor. Yeah, we did quite well during lockdown. We did surprisingly well. In fact, we were back in the studio the May after the March lockdown because there's no actors. So a lot of stuff became stop frame so we were gloved, masked, tested 3 times a week, and off we went like salt miners.
Just on the piggybacking on the question about the armature that you mentioned, all the puppets have a skeleton, don't they? In order to be able to move.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they are. That is the... Andy can speak to this much better than I can, but that is you get the character design, and then you have to work out what goes inside it, because without that armature being right, it is unanimatable. And you have to think about everything the puppet does. So it might walk, but it might also run, it might do a backflip, or it might dive off a branch. And whatever it does, there are at least two puppets in this where special puppets had to be built. Mr. Fox folds himself up behind a cider jar, and that was a special build, wasn't it, Andy, for the folding fox? And then there's the pretzel legs of Christopherson
Doing the yoga.
Doing the yoga, and that was a special build. But you quite often have to do a special build or a special armature. Quite often a puppet can't scratch the top of its head just because the design of it means that the arm isn't long enough. So even in the storyboard, it's got that.
I mean, sometimes
Maybe you can't do that.
Yeah, no.
So it
Depends on the time of day.
sometimes they can't sit, and a lot of the time, let's think about expense. So a key character, you're probably looking 12 to 20 grand, Andy? And beyond. Okay, so then you've got several iterations of your main characters. So, this is where the money is, and quite rightly too. They're cheaper than actors, but they're still expensive. And then you have background characters. So, you can't spend that much on your background characters. So what do they do? And there's a lot of discussion about, well, maybe this one doesn't speak, and maybe this one doesn't sit down, and maybe all this one does is blink. So can the bodies be solid? Can the legs be solid? And can they just have maybe just one jaw moves, something like that? And you see with the farmers, Bunsen Bean are quite uncomfortable speaking because they don't think they were ever intended. They've never intended they should speak. So although the Michael Gambon character is all singing or dancing, I don't think the other two were ever intended to do that. And then suddenly they were required to speak. So, there had to be some rapid adaptations to them to get them to do that. And this happens all the time, absolute promise. No, we want 20 background characters, none of them will speak and none of them will walk, and then suddenly it's the Dagenham girl pipers that coming over the girls. So.
Okay, you've got a question. Have this have my mic?
All I was going to say is that, you do get lost in the characters and the story, and the lighting really brings you in to the mood and the shifts and the realism of the animation. I just wanted to ask, as a novice, obviously in live action you have, even if the actors have to then do ADR, you still have them speaking live on set, and even the Foley that gets done after, you still get the rough sound in live action. So I just wondered how if the actors have done those voices before that you get to listen to before you decide how the characters are going to move or be moved, obviously, because it's not done in real time. So I just wondered how you do that, or if it's something you just really have a clear vision in your head of the scene and the dialogue and how it's going to run, and what comes first.
Okay. This is what happens. Script, casting, character design, then the actors do the script as if it is a radio play that is cut to length. The storyboard is drawn. The storyboard is then, each panel of the storyboard is filmed to length. This is what gives us what we call an animatic. So the animatic has sunk sound. So the dialogue you hear is almost the first thing that is done creatively after the script is written. So we have absolute final voice performance on 99.99% of the movie. And the way Wes works is a lot of that voice record is done in situ. So if they're in a field, he'll record them in a field. If they're on a motorbike, he'll record them sitting on a motorbike. So you have that baked into the track. You're not working. I mean, we do additional Foley. We do a bit of ADR. But in order to get the accuracy of lip sync, you cannot but work with the track that you will end up with, because it has to be syllable perfect. It has to be frame perfect. Otherwise, you see it slip. For the English language version. Obviously these are overdubbed, but then, you get the same problem you get with any overdubbed film, which is that there's slippage. But yeah, so that's what they have. So the animators hear the performance, and sometimes the casting affects the design of the character, and also conversely, often you often think, that the voice coming out of that puppet doesn't quite fit, and then you just have to live with it. So it's.
I'm afraid that I'm going to have to draw us to a close. But thank you very much for those excellent questions. And just I did a count up of how many Oscar-nominated films you've been associated with, and it comes to 15. That really is quite remarkable.
And 3 winners.
Yeah. But if you count Cara's, that's 4. I mean, that is quite remarkable.
Right, yeah.
That's amazing.
That's my wife.
And she dabbles, oh yes, in a very big way. And so you're something, I think let's see what happens to the Oscar-nominated short, Henry Sugar. But you've also worked on Poor Things, which is another.
Yeah.
I mean,
I did. That was fun.
Oh, that's from the memoirs.
Yeah. Can I just say, actually, in defence of everyone in this room who works in the stop frame animation business, all of whom are brilliant, if you make a stop frame movie, in terms of the Academy Awards, you are eligible for the Feature Animation Academy Award, and you might get a nomination for the music or the song. The very idea that you would be considered for editing, cinematography, or VFX, no one ever thinks about it. So we all go unrewarded. And the animation equivalent of the Oscars, the Annies, which has an award literally for who swept the cleanest floor, does not have a cinematography category.
Lord.
So although I've been associated with all those films, I will never hold a trophy in my hand.
Well, Tristan, this is one of the reasons, one of the many, that I wanted to speak to you of all the cinematographers.
I'm not bitter, Gary.
Tristan.